Page 17, paragraph 4. Naomi said, and her voice came out clearer than the room deserved, low and steady, as if she were not standing in a pressed housekeeping uniform with a dozen suited strangers measuring her worth by the card at her side. The indemnity language does not protect Whitmore Capital. It transfers post-closing liability to Whitmore Capital if the asset disclosures are later challenged. For one beat, no one moved. Rain pressed softly against the glass. Somewhere near the back wall, the heating vent exhaled a dry whisper. Then Evelyn Price gave a small smile that did not reach her eyes. That is not what it says. Naomi turned her gaze to the contract in front of Charles Whitmore, not to Evelyn, not yet. It says that in cleaner language 2 lines above. Then it narrows the exception in the sentence below. The exception looks routine, but it is not. It makes your firm responsible if the seller omitted material risk and claims the omission was made in preliminary reporting. If there is an investigation later, your signature makes the damage yours. Miles Carter let out a quiet breath through his nose, less like a laugh this time, and more like disbelief trying to survive. And you know this from housekeeping? He asked. Naomi did not answer him. Charles had not taken his eyes off her. The gold pen was still in his hand, but it had dropped half an inch from the page. Which sentence? He asked. Naomi felt the weight of every face in the room. She could smell the dark coffee cooling in porcelain cups, the paper and ink scent of fresh binders, the faint citrus of her own cleaning spray drying at the cuffs of her sleeves. She set the picture down carefully on the service card so no one would hear the tremor she refused to let into her voice. Second line under the indemnification header. The phrase after including, but not limited to. Read the part after that aloud. Daniel Cole, the young executive near the middle of the table, flipped to page 17 before anyone else. Naomi heard the quick, nervous rustle of expensive paper. Daniel leaned forward, eyes scanning, and then his shoulders changed. It was slight, but she saw it. A tightening. A pause. Charles noticed it too. Read it, he said. Daniel swallowed. His voice came out thinner than before. He read the clause once, then stopped halfway through and read it again, slower this time. The room did not laugh now. Miles shifted in his chair. Evelyn straightened, one manicured hand flattening over her legal pad. That interpretation is incomplete, she said sharply, but her tone had lost polish around the edges. Naomi finally looked at her. Then read the cross-reference on page 11, she said. The definition of preliminary reporting. Daniel turned pages with less confidence now, as if he already knew what he was going to find and did not want to meet it. Charles placed the pen on the table. The tiny click it made sounded louder than it should have. Daniel found page 11, traced a finger down the margin, and went still. Naomi knew that stillness. She had seen it on doctors before they walked into waiting rooms. On clerks before they admitted an error nobody wanted to own. On her own face in the mirror 3 winters ago, when she realized the loan papers her father had trusted were the reason they lost the house in Newark. Daniel looked up first at Evelyn, then at Charles. Sir, he said quietly, she is right. No one spoke after that. Not Evelyn. Not Miles. Not even the rain seemed loud enough to intrude. The whole room seemed to pull inward at once, shrinking around a woman they had almost laughed back into silence, while Charles Whitmore stared at Naomi Brooks as if, for the first time that morning, he understood exactly how expensive it could be to ignore the wrong voice. Charles Whitmore did not reach for the pen again. He leaned back slowly, the leather chair giving a faint creak beneath the shift of his weight, while his eyes stayed on the contract, as if the paper itself had betrayed him. Then he looked at Evelyn. How did this get into my final draft? His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. In a room like that, quiet authority carried farther than shouting ever could. Evelyn kept her chin lifted, but Naomi saw the change in her all the same. The perfect stillness was gone. It had been replaced by calculation. It is standard risk allocation language in transactions with deferred disclosures, she said. Daniel is reading it too narrowly, and she is reading it emotionally. Naomi felt the word land. Emotionally, neat and dismissive, like a label placed on a box before anyone had opened it. Charles turned toward Daniel. Is that true? Daniel glanced at Evelyn, then back to the page in front of him. He was young, maybe early 30s, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent too many nights chasing details other people got credit for. No, sir, he said. It is not emotional. It is structural. If the seller concealed exposure during preliminary reporting, the burden shifts here after signature. It is buried, but it is there. Miles Carter sat forward now, his amusement gone so completely it felt embarrassing in hindsight. He reached for the contract, flipping pages with an impatience that no longer looked confident. Around the table, the posture of the room changed inch by inch. Spines straightened. Coffee cups were set down untouched. A woman near the end of the table took off her glasses and cleaned them for no reason except that her hands needed somewhere to go. Naomi stood where she was, aware of everything at once. The wet gray skyline beyond the window, the chill from the vent above her shoulder, the tight seam at the cuff of her uniform, the faint ache in her arches after 7 hours on her feet. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt exposed. There was a difference between being invisible and being seen, and not all of it was comforting. Charles folded his hands on the table. "Ms. Brooks," he said, and it was the first time anyone in that room had used her name as if it belonged there. "How did you catch this?" Naomi hesitated. The truth was plain, but plain truths often sounded suspicious in rooms built on polished language. "I saw a loose page near the copy room," she said. "I recognized the wording." Evelyn gave a dry, restrained laugh. "Recognized it from where exactly?" Naomi turned to her. "From papers that took my father's house when I was 19. The room went still again, but this time the silence carried something different. Not shock. Wait. Naomi kept her voice level. The numbers looked harmless on the first page. The danger was in the definitions. It usually is. She did not mean to say more, but once the memory opened, it moved through her with the force of old weather. Her father at a kitchen table in Newark, reading with his glasses low on his nose. Her mother pretending not to worry. Her own community college books stacked beside a chipped sugar bowl. Then the letters. Then the phone calls. Then the kind of shame that came in envelopes. Naomi had learned early that ruin rarely announced itself like thunder. It arrived in clean fonts and confident signatures. Charles watched her for a moment longer than comfort allowed. Then he reached out, closed the binder, and slid it away from the signature line. The soft thud of cardboard against polished wood sounded final. "This meeting is paused," he said. "No one signs anything until I have an independent review." Evelyn opened her mouth, but Charles lifted one hand, and she stopped. "And nobody," he added, his gaze sweeping slowly across the faces at the table, "laughs the next time someone tries to save us from our own arrogance." Naomi did not wait to see who looked ashamed and who only looked inconvenienced. The moment Charles Whitmore stood, she reached for the silver pitcher, straightened the linen on her cart, and moved toward the door with the quiet efficiency that had carried her through years of being noticed only when something needed to disappear. Behind her, chairs scraped softly against the floor and low voices began to rise, but none of them followed her into the hallway. The corridor outside felt warmer, almost strangely human after the cold precision of the boardroom. Recessed lights glowed against cream-colored walls. The carpet muted every footstep. Through a narrow bank of windows at the far end, rain dragged silver lines down the glass, blurring the Hudson into a sheet of pewter. Naomi pushed the cart forward, its wheels whispering over the floor, and only then did she let herself breathe all the way out. Her hands were steady, but her chest was not. Under the starch of her uniform, her heartbeat was still trying to catch up with what had just happened. She turned into the service hallway, where the air smelled like coffee grounds, bleach, cardboard, and the faint metallic chill of industrial ice machines. It was a scent she knew better than perfume, better than comfort. Halfway to the utility closet, Carmen Ruiz from the morning banquet team nearly ran into her, a stack of folded napkins in her arms and surprise already written across her face. "Naomi, what on earth happened up there?" she asked. Naomi kept moving at first, then slowed. "I said something I was probably not supposed to say." Carmen blinked. "Everybody on this floor is talking at once. Mr. Lewis from security just walked by like he swallowed a light bulb." Naomi gave the smallest smile, tired and thin. "Then I guess they heard me." Carmen shifted the napkins higher against her chest and lowered her voice. "Did you get in trouble?" Naomi looked down at the faint watermarks on the steel rim of the pitcher. It was a simple question, but it landed somewhere complicated. Trouble was being seen when people preferred you silent. Trouble was speaking in rooms built to keep you in uniform and at a distance. Trouble was overdue medical bills folded in her locker beside a bus pass and a protein bar. I do not know yet, she said honestly. Carmen studied her for a second longer, then nodded with a kind of cautious admiration. Well, she said, whatever you did, it made rich people stop talking, and I have been working in this building 6 years. That alone sounds historic. Naomi almost laughed, but before the sound could come, her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron. The screen lit up with the dialysis center number. Her stomach tightened. She answered on the second ring and stepped closer to the wall, where the hallway dipped into a pocket of shadow between the linen room and the freight elevator. This is Naomi Brooks. The nurse on the other end sounded kind, which was rarely a good sign. There had been a change in schedule, she explained. Her mother, Ruth, had tolerated the last treatment poorly. They wanted to move the next session up to early morning and asked if Naomi could come in to sign revised paperwork. Naomi closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Yes, she said. I will be there. When the call ended, the hallway felt quieter than before. The fluorescent light above her hummed softly. Somewhere below, an elevator bell chimed. Naomi slipped the phone back into her apron and rested one hand on the card handle, grounding herself in the cool chrome. She had just saved a multi-million-dollar deal for people who probably spent more on lunch than she spent on groceries in a month, and all she could think about was whether she had enough left on her debit card to cover the parking garage at St. Luke's. Ms. Brooks. The voice came from behind her, measured and unmistakable. Naomi turned. At the far end of the hallway, just outside the boardroom doors, Charles Whitmore stood alone without his legal team, without his investors, without the protection of polished noise. His tie was slightly loosened now, and in his hand he carried the contract binder she had stopped him from signing. For a second, neither of them spoke. The hallway light caught the rain still clinging to the edges of the boardroom windows behind him, and for the first time that day Charles Whitmore did not look like the fixed center of a room built to obey him. He looked older, not weak, not softened exactly, but stripped of the easy certainty he had worn at the head of that table. Naomi kept one hand on the card handle. The chrome was cool against her palm. Sir, she said, because habit was still quicker than pride. Charles glanced once at Carmen, who immediately understood the shape of power even in silence, and murmured something about checking the banquet linens before slipping down the hall with her stack of napkins. Then it was just the two of them, the service cart, the muted hum of the building, and the binder in his hand. I owe you an apology, he said. Naomi blinked once, not because she had not heard him, but because she had. Men like him were trained to thank efficiency, reward loyalty, acknowledge performance. Apology was rarer. It did not belong as easily in their mouths. You do not owe me anything, she said quietly. Charles looked at her for a long moment. That is not true. His voice was lower now, unguarded in a way she had not expected. You saved me from signing a deal that could have cost this firm tens of millions of dollars. And before that happened, people in my boardroom laughed at you. I let it happen. Naomi lowered her eyes for one breath, then lifted them again. She had spent too much of her life accepting things she should not have had to accept, wrapping humiliation in politeness so she could survive the day and get to the next one. But something about the stillness of the hallway made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. You gave me 10 seconds, she said. That was more than most people would have done. Charles exhaled, almost like the answer disappointed him. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough to lower the distance between executive floor and service hall. Where did you learn to read language like that? Naomi hesitated. The nurse's voice from a minute earlier still echoed faintly in her head, along with the revised appointment time. The paperwork, the quiet dread of numbers she could not stretch any farther. Hudson Community College, she said. For a while, Charles glanced at the binder in his hand, then back at her. Accounting. Forensic accounting, Naomi said, and the word felt strange in the hallway, too sharp and academic beside the smell of bleach and coffee filters. 2 years. Nights. Then my father died, my mother got sick, and life kept sending bills faster than scholarships. Charles said nothing right away. He only watched her, as if he were trying to reconcile the uniform with the voice, the cart with the mind, the woman in front of him with the assumptions he had made 5 feet away from the signature line. Naomi had seen that look before. It usually came after people realized she did not fit neatly inside the role they had assigned her. Sometimes it turned into respect, sometimes suspicion. sometimes pity, which was the one she hated most. At the far end of the hall, an elevator opened and closed with a soft chime. Somewhere deeper in the service corridor, a tray of dishes rattled once and went still. Charles shifted the binder under his arm. "Come with me," he said. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly on the cart. "Sir, not back to the boardroom," he said. "My office. 5 minutes. I want you to show me exactly how you saw it, and I want to understand why my legal team did not." Naomi looked toward the freight elevator, then down at the phone in her apron pocket, as if she could somehow see the morning waiting for her there with hospital forms and parking tickets and the long fluorescent miles of St. Luke's. "I'm still on shift," she said. Charles followed her glance, and when he spoke again his tone changed just enough for her to notice. "Your phone call," he said carefully. "Is your mother all right?" Naomi did not answer at first. The question was simple, but kindness from powerful people always arrived wrapped in risk. Finally she said, "She has kidney failure. I need to get her to dialysis in the morning." Charles looked down once, then back at her, and when he did, something in his expression settled into place. "Then let us make this quick," he said. "And Ms. Brooks, after today, I do not think housekeeping is the most important thing you should be doing in this building." Naomi hesitated only a second before nodding. She pushed the card into the utility alcove, set the silver pitcher beside a stack of clean tumblers, and smoothed the front of her uniform with the flat of her hand, as if neatness could somehow steady the strange turn the afternoon had taken. Charles Whitmore waited without rushing her. Then he turned and led the way down the quieter corridor reserved for executives, his shoes making almost no sound on the thick carpet. Naomi followed 3 steps behind, close enough to smell the faint cedar and starch of his suit, far enough to remember exactly who he was and who she was supposed to be in a building like this. His office sat at the end of the hall behind a set of dark oak doors with brushed steel handles. Inside, the room was larger than her entire apartment, but it was not flashy in the way she expected. No gold, no oversized art shouting for attention. Just clean lines, dark shelves, floor-to-ceiling glass, a long credenza with framed photographs, and a city view so wide it made Manhattan look almost quiet. Rain moved across the windows in silver threads. The Hudson beyond was slate gray and restless. Charles set the binder on a polished desk and gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Please." Naomi remained standing for a breath, then sat carefully at the edge of the leather seat, back straight, hands folded in her lap. The chair was softer than anything in her home. It made her more aware of the stiffness in her shoulders, the ache in her feet, the detergent dryness at her knuckles. Charles opened the binder and turned it toward her. "Show me." Naomi leaned forward. Up close, the paper smelled faintly of toner and expensive stationery. She pointed to the clause with one clean fingernail. "The danger is not just here," she said. "It is in the chain." This sentence looks routine by itself. So does the definition on page 11. So does the disclosure carve-out on page 23. But together they create a door. Once you sign, the seller can claim incomplete reporting was part of preliminary review, and any hidden exposure becomes your responsibility to absorb before litigation is even settled. Charles listened without interrupting. Not the polite kind of listening he probably gave people he intended to dismiss later. Real listening. Naomi could see it in the stillness of his jaw, the way his eyes tracked every line she referenced, the absence of ego in his silence. "You saw all that from one loose page?" he asked. "No," Naomi said. "I saw enough on the loose page to know the rest would be built around it." A flicker passed through his expression, not disbelief now, but something closer to respect mixed with regret. And Evelyn missed it. Naomi chose her words carefully. Maybe she did. Maybe she did not. Charles looked up from the binder. The room grew quieter somehow. Even the rain seemed to pull back. "You think it was intentional?" Naomi let her gaze drift for a moment to the photographs on the credenza. One showed Charles much younger with a woman in a navy coat and a boy of about 10 standing between them, all 3 squinting into sunlight on what looked like Cape Cod. Another showed him at a podium. Another at a ribbon cutting. A life arranged in frames. "I think people do not bury things they want found," she said. Charles closed the binder halfway and rested both hands on it. He studied her the way a man studies the moment his world stops matching the story he told himself about it. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, What exactly are you doing pushing a housekeeping cart in my building? Naomi looked down at her hands, at the pale crescent marks her nails had left in her own skin earlier in the hallway, and when she answered, her voice was calm but thinner than before. Surviving, sir. Same as everybody else. I just got better at doing it in silence. The words stayed in the room after Naomi said them, quiet and plain and heavier than anything polished enough to belong there. Charles Whitmore did not answer right away. He moved to the window instead, one hand sliding into his pocket as he looked out over the rain-washed skyline, where the buildings blurred into sheets of steel and smoke and distance. For a moment, he seemed less like a man in command of a financial empire, and more like someone trying to remember when he had first mistaken composure for wisdom. Naomi remained where she was, hands folded, spine straight, resisting the old reflex to fill silence with apology. She had done that too many times in too many rooms. She had apologized for asking questions in class when she was younger, apologized for working double shifts, apologized for being late to one lecture after sitting 4 hours in an emergency room with her mother, apologized for needing more time, more grace, more life than the world seemed willing to give. She was tired of apologizing for surviving. Charles turned back to her slowly. Silence can be expensive, he said. Naomi gave the smallest nod, usually for the people with the least room to afford it. Something in that answer seemed to catch him. He crossed back to the desk, but he did not sit immediately. His eyes moved once more to the open binder, then to Naomi's face, as if the two no longer belonged to separate worlds. You said your father lost your house over language like this. Naomi looked at the edge of the desk, at the sharp line where dark wood met the reflection of the window. He trusted people with titles, she said. He thought if something was complicated, it must also be honest. By the time we understood what he had signed, we were already behind. Then everything got smaller after that. The apartment, the fridge, the way he spoke, the future too. Charles sat down at last, but more carefully than before, as though the chair had changed under him. And after that, Naomi breathed in through her nose, catching the faint scent of coffee and paper and rain cooled by glass. After that I studied harder. I thought numbers were safer than people. I worked mornings at a grocery store, nights in class, weekends wherever they would pay cash. Then my mother got sick, and safe stopped being the point. Her voice did not break. That was not her way. But the room heard the truth anyway. Charles rested his forearms on the desk. You left school because of medical bills. Because of life, Naomi said. Bills were just the loudest part of it. A faint, humorless smile touched one corner of his mouth, gone almost before it arrived. My son used to say that about bad news, he said. He said numbers were never the whole story, only the part people could print. Naomi glanced toward the framed photograph she had noticed earlier, the woman in the navy coat, the boy between them, sunlight across all three. Used to. Charles followed her gaze. When he answered, his voice lowered. Ethan lives in Seattle now. We speak on holidays and birthdays, and sometimes when one of us remembers to pretend time is not as sharp as it is. Naomi said nothing. Some distances were too familiar to need comment. The rain streaked thicker across the windows, softening the river until it looked like brushed metal. Charles stood again and walked to the credenza, where a crystal bowl held business cards and a fountain pen rested beside a leather portfolio. He picked up neither. Instead, he turned back and said, I built a company around recognizing risk before it became catastrophe, and this afternoon the clearest mind in the building was pushing a housekeeping cart. Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, not out of shame, but because praise could feel almost as dangerous as contempt when it came from someone with power. I was just paying attention, she said. Charles shook his head once. No, you were doing what everyone else in that room is paid to do, only you did it better. Then he walked back to the desk, lifted the office phone, and pressed a single button. When his assistant answered, his tone was calm, precise, and impossible to mistake. Hold all afternoon appointments, he said, and get human resources, legal compliance, and finance upstairs. I want them here within 20 minutes. Also, find out who hired Naomi Brooks and why her resume never crossed my desk. Naomi felt the room change the moment he said her name into the phone. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the air to lose its old shape. In every other job she had worked, being noticed by management usually meant a missing item, a schedule change, a complaint, a reminder that somebody above had measured her and found her replaceable. This felt different, and that difference unsettled her more than she expected. Charles set the receiver down with the calm precision of a man who had made a decision and already moved past hesitation. "I am going to ask you something, Ms. Brooks, and I want an honest answer." Naomi looked at him across the desk, the city reflected in the glass behind his shoulders like a second, ghosted skyline. "All right. If I place that contract in front of you right now," he said, resting one hand on the binder, "could you walk my team through every place it fails?" Naomi did not answer at once. The question touched the tender edge between what she knew and what life had allowed her to prove. She could hear the soft hum of the climate control overhead, the distant chime of an elevator opening somewhere down the hall, the rain ticking faintly against the windows in long, patient lines. "Not every place without time," she said at last, "but enough to stop you from signing it blind." Charles gave a slow nod, as if that answer mattered more than confidence ever could. "Good." He moved behind the desk and opened a drawer. From it, he pulled a yellow legal pad and a black pen, then placed both in front of her. The gesture was simple, but it landed harder than praise. For a second, Naomi only looked at the pen. It had probably cost more than the shoes she wore to work. "What is this?" she asked. "Paper," Charles said, "and a chance to show people what they should have seen before today." Naomi looked up. "Why?" He held her gaze without blinking. "Because I do not think this afternoon was an accident. I think someone assumed I would trust the room more than the truth. I would like to know exactly how wrong they were." Before Naomi could answer, there was a knock at the door. Not the casual kind. 2 measured taps, followed by a pause. Charles said, "Come in," and the door opened on a woman in her 50s with silver-framed glasses and a tablet held neatly against her blazer. Naomi recognized her from the executive floor, though only in passing. People called her Mrs. Halpern and lowered their voices when she walked by. Behind her stood Daniel Cole, binder in hand, his expression tight with thought rather than fear now. "Human resources is on the way," Mrs. Halpern said. "Compliance as well. Finance is joining by video from Midtown. Legal is delayed." Charles let that last word hang for half a beat. "Of course they are." His eyes shifted to Daniel. "Did you review page 23? Daniel stepped farther into the office. "Yes, sir." Ms. Brooks was right again. The carve-out language reinforces the transfer of exposure. It is disguised as timing protection, but functionally it turns the buyer into a shield. Mrs. Halpern's brows rose slightly, the smallest crack in an otherwise disciplined face. Her gaze moved to Naomi, taking in the housekeeping uniform, the polished shoes worn thin at the toes, the legal pad now resting in front of her like an unanswered question. Naomi knew that look too. It was not mockery this time. It was recalculation. Charles gestured toward the chair beside the desk. "Sit, Daniel." Then to Naomi he said, with quiet certainty that made the whole room listen, "Ms. Brooks, start at page 11. I want everyone who walks into this office to understand exactly how close they came to making a very expensive mistake because they were too busy measuring status to recognize competence." Naomi picked up the pen, not to write yet, but to steady her hand around something that felt familiar. The weight of it settled her. Numbers, clauses, definitions, cross-references, those things had always made more sense to her than the rooms built around them. She turned the binder to page 11 and drew a clean line beneath a paragraph on the yellow pad. "This definition is where the problem begins," she said. Her voice was calm, but now it carried differently, not because it was louder, but because nobody in the room was spending energy pretending not to hear her. Daniel leaned forward in the chair beside the desk, binder open on his knee. Mrs. Halpern remained standing near the door, tablet against her chest, the posture of a woman used to collecting facts before she offered opinion. Charles stood behind his desk with both hands resting on the back of his chair, eyes on the page Naomi had indicated. "Preliminary reporting sounds temporary," Naomi continued. "It sounds harmless. Like an incomplete draft, something that will be corrected later. But the wording here is wide enough to absorb material omissions without naming them as misconduct. That matters, because the seller can later claim any missing risk data belonged to the preliminary phase, not the final disclosure phase." She slid the binder half an inch so Daniel could see the next reference. "Then page 17 makes Whitmore Capital responsible for liability tied to those omissions once the deal closes." and page 23 protects the timing of that transfer by describing it as continuity protection. Mrs. Halpern's expression changed first. It was small, almost invisible, but Naomi saw it. The eyes sharpened. The chin lifted slightly. The moment a professional stops listening politely and starts listening seriously. So the language is layered, Mrs. Halpern said. Not false on its face. Dangerous in sequence. Naomi nodded. Exactly. Another knock came at the door, followed by two people entering with the hushed urgency of those who knew they had been summoned into something already moving. One was a tall man from compliance with rain on the shoulders of his navy coat and a laptop tucked under one arm. The other was a human resources director named Andrea Bell, polished and composed, carrying a folder thick enough to suggest a hurried search through records. Behind them, the wall screen flickered on, and a finance executive from Midtown appeared in a conference box, adjusting his glasses as if he had joined expecting numbers and found a reckoning instead. Charles did not waste time. Ms. Brooks is walking us through why this contract should never have reached my signature line, he said. I want every person in this room and on that screen to understand two things. First, how close we came to being trapped. Second, how someone in housekeeping saw what our own structure missed. The compliance officer sat. Andrea Bell remained standing for a moment, looking from Charles to Naomi and then to the folder in her hand. It was the kind of look that suggested discovery arriving a few minutes too late. Naomi kept her eyes on the binder, but she felt the shift all the same. She continued, marking 3 points on the yellow pad in neat block letters. Definition. Transfer. Shield. Bad contracts do not usually hide in big dramatic lines, she said. They hide in language people are too rushed or too impressed to question. On the screen, the finance executive frowned and asked for the page reference again. Daniel gave it before Naomi could. Mrs. Halpern asked for a copy of the seller disclosures. The compliance officer was already typing. And then Andrea Bell cleared her throat softly, opened the folder, and said the words that changed the room all over again. Mr. Whitmore, before this goes any further, there is something you need to see in Ms. Brooks's hiring file. Andrea Bell opened the folder with the careful expression of someone who already regretted being the person holding it. The paper inside was crisp, recently pulled, but the story it carried had clearly been sitting untouched for much longer. Ms. Brooks did not enter the building through a standard housekeeping referral, Andrea said. Naomi felt every eye turned toward her again, and this time the attention did not feel mocking. It felt surgical. Exact. Charles held out his hand. Let me see it. Andrea passed him the top sheet, then another. Charles read the first page in silence, then the second more slowly. The office grew so quiet Naomi could hear the faint tapping of rain against the glass and the software of the wall screen. Daniel glanced toward her, then toward the documents in Charles's hand, confusion beginning to give way to understanding. Mrs. Halpern lowered her tablet. Even the compliance officer stopped typing. Charles looked up. You applied here 14 months ago, he said. Naomi kept her hands folded around the pen. Yes, sir. Junior risk analyst, he read. Then contract review associate 6 weeks later. Naomi nodded once. She remembered both applications too well. The bus ride downtown in shoes that pinched. The borrowed blazer from Carmen's cousin. The way she had stood in a mirrored restroom before the interview, smoothing the cuffs and telling herself not to sound tired. Why were you hired through facilities? Charles asked. Andrea answered before Naomi could. According to the notes, her analyst application was marked Do Not Advance due to employment inconsistency and lack of recent corporate placement. She hesitated, then turned one more page. The second application was never formally reviewed. It was routed out after an internal comment from legal. Charles's gaze sharpened. What comment? Andrea swallowed. Not a culture fit for client-facing risk. No one moved after that. The words sat in the center of the office like something sour left out too long. Naomi did not need to look at anyone to know how they had landed. She had heard cleaner versions of that sentence all her life. Too much gap in the resume. Too informal. Too direct. Too quiet until it mattered. Too black for some rooms and too honest for most of the rest. Charles read farther down the page, then pulled out another document from the folder. His expression changed again, but now it was not anger first. It was disbelief. You had a recommendation from Professor Martinhale, he said. Naomi blinked. She had not expected that name to survive in a file buried under time and dust. "He taught forensic accounting," she said softly. "He wrote that I had exceptional pattern recognition." Daniel let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no amusement in it. "That tracks," he murmured. Charles kept reading. Top 5% in financial analysis. Internship with Newark Forensic Audit Partners. Published student paper on concealed liability transfer in distressed asset sales. He lifted his eyes to Naomi. "You wrote about concealed liability transfer." Naomi felt heat rise behind her ribs, not from pride exactly, but from the strange ache of being found by the very thing life had forced her to set down. "Yes, sir." Years ago, on the wall screen, the finance executive removed his glasses completely. Mrs. Halpern looked from Naomi to the folder, and then to Charles with the blunt clarity of someone who had just watched the company embarrass itself in broad daylight. Andrea Bell closed her eyes for half a second, as if bracing for what came next. Charles set the papers down with extreme care, which somehow felt more dangerous than if he had slammed them. "So let me understand this correctly," he said, his voice calm enough to make everyone else uneasy. "A woman with proven talent in exactly the kind of risk my company claims to respect was screened out, pushed aside, and handed a cart because someone decided she did not fit the room. And today that same room nearly signed away millions while she was polishing its glass. No one tried to defend the file. Not Andrea Bell, who kept both hands on the folder as if paper could suddenly become heavier. Not Mrs. Halpern, whose silence had shifted from professional restraint to quiet indictment. Not the finance executive on the wall screen, who looked as though he had just watched a balance sheet grow a conscience. Charles Whitmore stood at the desk with Naomi's application pages spread before him, and for the first time since she had entered his office, he looked not merely disappointed in the people around him, but disappointed in the system that had carried his name while failing his standards. He turned one page back, then another, rereading the notes as if repetition might make them less insulting. It did not. "Who wrote this?" he asked. Andrea's voice was careful. The culture fit comment was entered from legal review routing. The initials match Evelyn Price's office. The room did not react loudly. It did not need to. The truth had its own sound. It was in the way Daniel lowered his eyes, in the way Mrs. Halpern's jaw set, in the way the rain at the windows seemed suddenly louder, as if the whole city had leaned in to hear what happened when a company finally saw the cost of its own blindness. Charles looked at Naomi. "Did you know?" Naomi sat very still, the yellow legal pad near her elbow, the black pin resting between her fingers. She thought of the first interview she never got, the second application that vanished into silence, the polite emails that never came, the way the facility's recruiter had smiled kindly and said there was immediate opening in housekeeping if she was willing to work hard. She had been willing. She had been desperate enough to call willingness by another name. "I suspected," she said. "People do not usually say the truth out loud. They just move you where your voice will not inconvenience them." Charles closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, something in him had settled into decision. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I cannot undo what happened before today." Naomi nodded once. There was no bitterness in the motion, only recognition. Life had taught her long ago that apologies did not reverse time. They only revealed whether someone had finally looked at it honestly. "No, sir," she said. "You cannot." Charles placed both palms flat on the desk. "But I can decide what happens next." Naomi heard the words, but she did not let hope move too fast. Hope could be as reckless as ignorance if you handed it too much power too soon. She had seen sudden generosity before, the kind that glowed for a day and disappeared by payroll. So she answered with the same steadiness that had carried her this far. "With respect, sir, I did not speak up today to get anything." Daniel looked at her then, really looked, and whatever he saw seemed to humble him. Charles gave a slow, almost pained nod. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why you should." He turned toward Andrea. "Effective immediately, freeze any action related to Ms. Brooks's current position. I want a full review of every application flagged through legal in the last 2 years. I want the routing history, the reviewer names, and the rejection language. Tonight." Then to Mrs. Halpern he said, "Prepare an independent audit of this contract trail and every communication attached to it." Finally, he looked back at Naomi, and when he spoke again his voice had lost the distance of title and gained something rarer. "Tomorrow morning, After you take care of your mother, I would like to offer you a seat at this table, not as charity, not as symbolism, but because this company nearly paid the price for confusing status with substance, and I do not intend to make that mistake twice. Naomi did not answer right away. The offer hung in the office with the weight of something both generous and overdue, and she had lived long enough to know those were not the same thing. Outside the windows, the rain had begun to thin, softening from hard silver streaks into a finer mist that left the skyline looking washed clean around the edges. Inside, no one moved. Daniel sat with the binder open on his knee, watching her with the careful attention people gave to moments they knew would matter later. Andrea Bell still held the folder against her ribs, though now it seemed less like paperwork and more like evidence. Mrs. Halpern stood near the door with her tablet lowered, her expression unreadable except for the slight lift at one brow, as if she already understood that the next thing Naomi said would reveal more about the room than anything the executives had said all afternoon. Naomi placed the pen gently on the legal pad. "I appreciate the offer," she said, and her voice remained steady, but softer now, touched by the exhaustion she had kept out of it for hours. "But I need to be clear about something. I cannot be your lesson of the day." Charles did not flinch. If anything, he seemed to listen more closely. Naomi went on. "I do not want to be placed in a chair so everyone can feel better about what they missed. I do not want applause for surviving. And I do not want a polished version of fairness that disappears when the headlines do." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This was not shock. It was reckoning. Charles gave a slow nod, once, as if each word had landed exactly where it should. "That is fair," he said. "Then let me be equally clear. I am not offering you visibility. I am offering you work that matches your mind." The visibility came on its own when the truth entered the room. Naomi looked at him, searching his face for the familiar signs of performance, the smooth sincerity of powerful men who knew how to sound changed without changing at all. What she found instead was fatigue, intelligence, and something rarer than either, the discomfort of a man who had been forced to see the gap between his values and the machinery operating under his name. "My mother comes first," Naomi said. "Every time." "Then she should," Charles replied. "Tomorrow morning you take her to dialysis. After that, if you still wish to walk away, no one here will stop you. But if you come back, it will be as contract review consultant on a 90-day basis, reporting directly through compliance until we rebuild this process properly. Full salary, full benefits, no symbolism." Daniel's head lifted at that, not in objection, but in quiet approval. Mrs. Halpern's mouth softened by half an inch, which on her felt almost like warmth. Andrea Bell exhaled slowly, as though the room had finally chosen honesty over convenience. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, and in that brief pocket of stillness, she saw her mother at the dialysis center under fluorescent lights, cardigan folded over her lap, always trying to smile first so other people would not worry. She saw unpaid bills. She saw the apartment kitchen with its flickering light above the sink. She saw 19-year-old Naomi in Newark swearing that if she ever learned how these traps worked, she would never let them swallow someone else in silence again. When she looked up, her face was calm. 90 days, she said. "I earn the chair. I do not inherit it." Charles gave the faintest hint of a smile, tired but real. "Agreed." Then he reached for the office phone once more. "Andrea," he said without taking his eyes off Naomi, "have payroll draft the contract tonight. Mrs. Halpern, make sure the authority is real and not decorative. Daniel, I want Ms. Brooks copied on every document tied to this deal before close of business." He paused, then added, "And arrange a car for tomorrow morning. St. Luke's. Round trip." Naomi started to protest, but Charles lifted a hand, not to silence her, only to stop the burden from becoming an argument. "That is not charity," he said quietly. "That is what respect looks like when it finally gets practical." The next morning, the city looked different through the tinted window of the black sedan waiting outside Naomi's apartment building. Not softer exactly, just less hostile than it had the day before. The driver stepped out to open the rear door, but Naomi shook her head and helped her mother in first, one careful hand at Ruth Brooks's elbow, the other steadying the canvas tote that carried insurance papers, a bottle of water, and the cardigan Ruth always brought even in spring because hospitals were never warm in the right way. Ruth settled into the seat and looked around at the clean leather, the quiet, the soft hum of the engine, then up at her daughter with a question already forming in her eyes. Naomi only smiled and said, "It is a long story." At St. Luke's, the fluorescent lights still buzzed, the coffee in the lobby still smelled burnt, and the nurses still moved with the tired kindness of people who held too much of other people's fear in their hands. Some things did not change just because the world had surprised you once. Naomi signed the revised forms, asked the right questions, folded every receipt into her bag, and sat beside her mother during treatment with her shoulders finally resting against the vinyl chair instead of against the whole weight of the month. Ruth watched her for a while before speaking. "Something happened yesterday," she said. Naomi looked down at their joined hands, her mother's fingers cooler than usual, thin but steady. "Yes," she said. Ruth smiled faintly. "Good something or expensive something?" Naomi laughed then, soft and brief, the sound catching even her by surprise. "Maybe both," she said. She told her part of it. Not the whole polished absurdity of a boardroom full of silence. Not the file. Not the insult hidden in the phrase culture fit. But enough. Enough for Ruth's eyes to fill without spilling. Enough for her mother to squeeze her hand and whisper, "Baby, I always knew they were standing too close to you to see you clearly." By the time the treatment ended, the rain had lifted. The sidewalks outside the hospital shone in broken silver under a pale afternoon sun, and when the car pulled up again, Naomi felt the old instinct to refuse help rise and then pass. Some kindness did not weaken you when you accepted it. Sometimes it simply gave your tired life one less hill to climb. At Whitmore Capital, the lobby doors opened before she reached them. No housekeeping cart waited near the service hall. No pressed uniform hung in her locker. Upstairs, Charles Whitmore stood at the end of the conference table in a room washed clean by daylight, the contract binder closed and set aside. Daniel already seated with a stack of revised disclosures. Mrs. Halpern beside him, her glasses low on her nose. When Naomi entered, no one laughed. No one glanced at her name tag because she was not wearing one. She had on a navy blazer Carmen's cousin had insisted she keep, a white blouse, and the same sensible shoes, still worn at the toes, still hers. Charles stepped back from the head of the table and touched the empty chair to his right with 2 fingers. It was a small gesture, almost quiet enough to miss, but the whole room felt it. Naomi looked at the chair, then at the pages waiting for her, then out at the glass where sunlight had finally broken through and laid one clear stripe across the polished wood. She took her seat without ceremony, opened the top document, and began to read. Behind her, the city kept moving, taxis threading through light, steam rising off grates, windows catching gold. Inside, nobody rushed to speak. The room had learned something overnight. Not about contracts, though that too. Something harder. Something human. That intelligence did not arrive in the right color, or the right title, or the right side of the table.